Hi, this is Marshall Henley, president of Beza Performance, and this is the Beza Performance live stream. Today is S&OP Thursday, the second and fourth Thursday of every month. We get to spend time with Doug Dedman, who's a friend, associate, and the president of DBM Systems, who we use exclusively for all of our S&OP implementations. So I want to introduce Doug, and how's it going today, Doug?
It's going well, Marshall. Good to see you.
It's funny. This is the second one we've done, and I'm still, as the producer, I have to click stuff while I'm talking, and I'm not very good at it. So,
We'll get it right. Probably by the
yeah,
sixth or seventh one, we'll be good, right, Marshall?
it's the comic relief at the beginning of all of these. So today, we were talking about constraints. I feel very constrained in my bandwidth to do these things, but the idea today is we wanted to talk about constraints on families and that kind of stuff. But before we do that, I want to level set. We have kind of a definition of what we consider to be functional SNOP. Like if this isn't present, you've really got a huge hole in your SNOP. So I want to bring that up and talk about that first. That we really see SNOP as the president's handle on the business, which implies the president is obviously in the executive SNOP meeting, but also actively participating and making some decisions there, which we'll get into at some other point. We would say that the process and the methodology has to create a clear link between strategy and execution. It has to set the flow rate for the business as part of the decision process in the meetings, participated in by the executive. It has to establish clear RACI accountabilities to be managed by the executive, mostly the R and the A, the responsible, accountable. It needs to provide a process with regular and repeatable disciplines that people can participate in, and more than anything, it needs to be measurable and actionable so that both the S&OP process itself, but also the business can be improved. So that's kind of the level setting we start with. From there, I think, Doug, it would be good to kind of explain why we are so adamant, and we are adamant about using constraint-based families in what we call the 5-section sheet, which we'll be talking about today and every week. So, Doug, why are we so adamant about constraint-based families?
Yeah, and I think the root of that, Marshall, goes back to the points you just had brought up on the screen before, right? This idea that we've got to be able to link the SNOP process to the strategy. It's got to be able to provide or help us make a decision on the flow rate,
Mhm.
that clear RACI, and it's got to be measurable. But there's some challenges when you start thinking about this, and especially as someone's getting started on the SNOP journey, or maybe they've been doing it for a while, because a lot of people start out that way or start thinking about, okay, I've got a problem I have to solve, and SNOP is going to help me solve part of that problem.
Right.
And a lot of the thinking on that is the problem I need to solve is I've got to get a better demand plan. And I would say in many cases, especially if you talk to the operations side of the house, what's the problem in our organization? If we could just get the salespeople to give us a better demand plan, right? So let's get it focused so we can bring them in and get a good demand plan. I think the other thing on that is people like to think about the fact that what's the biggest variable that comes in to the organization? Well, that's the outside impact, right? Which is the stuff outside of my control,
Yeah.
which would be the demand plan, right? So that it
Sure.
just makes sense to say I've got to pivot towards that and make that part of my important piece, right? And the other one that's kind of interesting and why people get challenged with this is it can get really difficult when you start to say a constraint-based family. What do you
Mhm.
mean, and what is the constraint in the business, right? Because I think a lot of places that we've worked with, they might have multiple products going down a single line, right? There might, so figuring out the constraints in the families
Yeah.
isn't it's not easy, right? So people kind of pivot back towards what makes sense and go, well, I'm just going to do it by sales product family, and that's real easy, and then we'll figure out the other side. But the challenge is if you don't link the sales side to what your constraints are, you're going to miss a lot of the points that you brought up at the very beginning of the presentation there, which, a real important part of this is how do we set the flow rate for the business, and how do we get
Yeah.
accountability and match the pieces together?
So we like to say that if you can't build it, you can't ship it. And so I think sometimes the term constraint gets people thinking of, theory of constraints or bottleneck breaking. We're not at that micro of a level. We're talking about kind of macro constraints. Maybe a little bit of a touch on that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, it's true. Like, and if you look at it, SNOP feeds into like your master scheduling, which you now you get down into like the sequencing on the plant floor and all that sort of stuff. We are really talking at that production plan level, at really a volume level constraint plan, where I have some expression of what my capability is, and then I'm actually putting the supply plan against that, right? And
Yeah.
so and really this is, I mean, so important right now because everyone we're working with is sitting in a constrained situation today, right?
Yeah. Like
And that
93%.
Exactly. And that manifests itself in extended lead times,
Yeah.
missed shipments, really struggling with the supply chain as we churn through what we should be doing production wise. And so, and I don't just say it, is being more important now, but like I can't imagine how I can do SNOP and drive to decisions without doing that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's really the kind of the important part if I think about this. And by the way, it's not mutually exclusive. You can't, you just because we do this by constraints, you can still get the focus to fix up what your demand planning is. And in
Right.
fact, um, it becomes more focused on the execution against that demand plan, and then what does that mean for the demand plan going forward. And that really, unless you pull everything together, it doesn't
Yeah.
it's hard to see that. So
Yeah. So if you can't make it, you can't ship it, but you also got to sell it to ship it. So the problem, I guess, is always kind of both. And we understand why people maybe get in times other than these maybe are really drawn towards more of a demand stream focus on those things. But I think maybe another way to position it is the deliverable from the SNOP meeting, the executive SNOP meeting, isn't something that is that needs a lot more work to be executed if you do it right with what we call a constraint. But a master scheduler can take it and run the whole month with it. They got to deal with the mix issues, and there's a lot of stuff but it's an executable deliverable because of the constraints are mapped back to what that master scheduler, or if you're using Kanbans, just the Kanban sizing decisions, all that comes from the SNOP supply plan because of this ability to define it by constraints. Is that a
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not really a question.
yeah, I would say one of the other important parts
Yeah.
is think about SNOP. It's a couple things. One thing for SNOP, it's about how do we establish that plan going forward. But it's a huge part of it is evaluating the plan that you made and how did you do against that plan, right? And
Right.
you've heard me say this many times. I use the term, it's stepping out of the fray, right? Like the day to day minutia of the issues that are coming up and all the things that happen. Because, like you said, the master scheduler can put their plan out, but everybody's going to say, hey, the minute I start executing that plan, something happens, right? I got a customer order change. We get a press that goes down, and now all of a sudden we're in the let's call it the read and react. But really, what you want to part of what you're doing with SNOP is you're evaluating your ability to put together a good and executable plan,
Yeah.
right? And even though if I put my operations hat on, I like to think about the problem kind of coming at me from sales. I would say in a lot of organizations, one of the big challenges and one of the big accountabilities, going back to this idea of accountability, is I need accountability to the plan, the build plan that I said I was going to do.
Right.
And it's fairly surprising sometimes how poor of a job many organizations do around that. And I would say right now, that is one of the big challenges because it might not be an internal problem, but people are
Right.
facing problems that, like right now, man, I've got manpower issues. I've got, so as we went through COVID and you lost production days because you had people out, you've got all those issues going on. but then you also have supply chain issues that impact. So now all of a sudden I'm pulling stuff off the line because I don't have all the components I need, right? So all of those sort of things. So this idea of saying, well, how much are you going to build? And how much did you build?
Yeah.
Right? And how much can you build, which are three different questions, right? How much did you say you're going to build? How much did you build? And how much can you build? Those three things need to be very clear, right? Both kind of going forward and what you just happened, and
Yeah.
then be able to look at that against the demand plan.
So I could see maybe folks being skeptical that in right now with so much fluctuation and unpredictability on the supply side, how is this that helpful? But I think it's just the opposite. It's even more helpful because it really hones in on what are the isolated risks to my plan. And we just participated in an executive S&OP meeting today with a business that has the group president for the business has, I think, 4 businesses he's running, and he was actually in the executive S&OP meeting helping to ratify, yeah, this is the right way to go. And then they drove down on the supply plan to looking at the risks, and they were talking about, plans and timeframes with the president, eh, following up on those plans and timeframes for things like designing out component suppliers where they weren't stable enough with their supply ability. And so that's the kind of stuff that you can start talking about with really concrete activity around the 5-section sheet. So, and if
Yeah,
you don't mind, Doug, I'd like to pivot to showing that. We like to spend as much time in that as we can. So
sure.
I'll let Doug kind of elaborate even more on, why we like constraint-based families when we pull this up here. So
Yeah.
this is the 5-section sheet. Doug, take a minute just to redefine what it is for everybody so we can.
Sure, absolutely. And I,
Okay.
at the risk of using all my same material every week, I'll
Yeah.
use, I'll tell the same dad jokes. I'm a dad, so there you go. You get the dad jokes, but it's a 5-section sheet because it has 5 sections, right? So,
But boom.
yeah, thanks, Marshall. um, but if you look at it, right, in that 5-section sheet, it covers off all of the things that really get into a balanced plan. So when I said it's got to be constraint based, I'm going to start this time on the supply piece. So this
Okay.
section right here is the supply, right? And that supply is expressed as a production plan going forward as far out as you are in your horizon, right? And you've got to cover far enough into what is your frozen plan and also into cumulative supply chain lead time. But that is the supply. That's your plan of what you think you're going to supply. But it also is, and I seem to be missing it on here right now. Should be a line of my capability. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to bring it up. I'll
Sure.
come to this in a second.
And while
So
you're doing that, I'll just point out that we're looking at units, not dollars. You can't do an S&OP process with dollars because we start with dollars on the demand side, but we got to translate it to units by family.
So I just changed the view a little bit. I'll come
Yeah,
back to that one, but just because I wanted to pull that in. But yeah, so we have an actual capability line that's on here that basically when we look at the supply plan going forward, it can't really go above that capability plan. And so when I'm thinking about this, right, I've got a demand picture that's coming in, which if we think about demand, there's 2 elements to it, right? One is booking,
hmm,
and one is shipping. And shipping actually, we think about it as demand, but really shipping is an outcome of the process, right?
yeah.
Because I've got to be able to build it, and I have to have the orders, and I come up with a shipping plan that I can actually produce. That I can
Sales and
actually
operations share the constrained
Right,
shipment plan. Yeah.
absolutely. They share that. And so this is my shipments going forward. This is my historical shipments. And I've got the same here on bookings, my orders coming in and that actually happened, and then my booking plan going out. And so even though we're looking at this by constraint, one of the important things that we look at in terms of thinking about the family, because we can't ignore the demand side, but we want to put it into, I'm going to call it an accountable and an actionable sort of level. And so what we do to achieve that for this top part of the demand, which is really bookings, shipments and as well my aged backlog, is we break this down to demand streams. And so I'm just going to do a shipment drill down to show that to you. And the demand streams will be typically divided up by either how do I forecast a customer, what's the lead time to that customer, what is the who is accountable for that demand plan, because we want to make sure that when we're looking at both our shipment and our booking call, that it's a valid plan. And so, for example, on this customer here, which is one of our large customers, this demand plan going forward here, right? The shipping plan going forward is also supported by a backlog plan. And then in their case, they're actually forecasting really starting in month 5. So
Right.
I want to validate that that plan actually makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
And so even though we say focus on it by constraint, I still need to have a certain amount of accountability and granularity at the demand level.
Right.
I could pull a specific demand stream up for you just so you can see what it looks like. So if I go back to that example site and my example family, and I'll just pull my one large customer up, you're going to see some historical information that's fairly important for this particular family. And if you look at it, so this is one of those large customers, and you can see we built a shipping plan out here. We actually calculated a booking plan, so we had that. And in this case, the shipping plan, we are essentially saying our shipping plan is our backlog for the first 5 months, and then we are getting into our forecast. And so by looking at that, the question would be, well, what is the expected lead time of this particular large customer? Because right now, based on our backlog and based on our balanced plan, any order I take today, I'm really not planning on shipping that order that comes in today until I get out here to month 6. And
Hmm.
so, and that's an important thing because I should be able to at least see that and see if does that line up with
Yeah.
strategically where I want to go with that large customer.
Yeah. That's a great point. I always make a point to say SNOP doesn't answer questions unless you're talking about having a balanced plan. Like, I have a balanced plan or not? Yes or no. But it forces the organization to answer the right questions.
Right. That's it's a really good point. And I always say that SNOP has to reflect where you are,
Yeah.
right? So that it reflects where you are, but it also reflects where you want to go to. And too often, I'm a Canadian, so I would use the term, people like to skate over whatever the issue happens to be, right? So I want to present the perfect picture. This is what I really want you to see. Well, the reality now, and in most businesses, in fact, you mentioned the SNOP meeting we're in this morning, in a whole chunk of their families, they're having issues,
Yeah.
right? And so it was a pretty robust discussion as we went through a lot of
But
that. And
but empowered by 5-section sheet with constraint-based families, because you could
yes,
see
yep,
crystal clear what your backlog was, what your capacity was, and what your risk were to that plan. And that plan isn't good enough, right? We've got to over time eat up the backlog and do some things there. But
because it's a good point. If you I'll just go back to the 5-section sheet for a second, if you don't mind pulling it back up, Marshall.
yeah,
Just a
no
couple
problem.
comments I was going to make on this, and let me just go back to that other view here one time to the default one. The point I wanted to make on this was that, and we saw this morning as we went through the process with these guys, was that an imbalance in the plan is going to show up in a couple different places potentially in the 5-section sheet. So
Okay.
for example, if I'm not building enough to meet to my shipping plan, I'm going to end up with a negative inventory going forward, because this is just simply a calculation, right? This is
Right.
an actual on-hand inventory. We're going to add whatever we said we're going to produce, right? And we're going to ship out whatever we had in our shipping plan. And so if I'm not constraining my shipping plan back to what my production plan is, I'm going to start to see a negative inventory growing. And so when you look at the
Which is
situation,
impossible. I mean, that means
yeah,
you really
I,
don't
I
even have
always
a planet.
yeah, I always joke about that. It's like it's like a black hole, right? The closer you get to that negative inventory, it just sucks you in, and that's the end of life,
Yeah.
right? But um, I'm a consultant, not a comedian, so
Yeah.
take it for what it's worth, right? But the negative number really shows an imbalance in the plan.
Right.
The other part that gets interesting is once I constrain my shipping plan, right? Because in this case, you can see they've done a good job of constraining the shipping plan and holding to a target inventory. But I could have situations where I'm not where I if I constrain the shipping plan, but I don't constrain the booking plan, the difference between the two will end up on the backlog line, which is right here, right? And you'll see the backlog growing as you go forward,
Mhm.
right? So if sales is forecasting a booking plan, right? And
Yeah.
you are taking that booking plan and developing the shipping plan, but then I constrain the shipping plan because of what my capability is, the difference to that has to go to the backlog. If it doesn't go to the backlog, because I've asked my sales guys to say, what can you sell? And
Right.
if it doesn't go to the backlog line, right, what that means is I'm if it doesn't go to the backlog line, it's going to your competitor, is kind of how I always say that, right? The only way to
Yeah.
reduce backlog is I've got to increase my production, or I have to decrease the order inflow, which is a really important thing to think about, right?
Which,
Everybody
yeah,
who's
that was on the table today with one
Yep,
family. I mean, they
yep.
they couldn't potentially they had quite a bit of business at risk in that category as backlog was increasing, and you can't snap your fingers and fix it without having a really good understanding of what's feeding the constraints for that supply plan, which is exactly why this is so critical, that you build your families around constraints, and then you feed it with demand streams. The way I like to think about it and explain it, even though I'm not the S&OP expert that you are, is S&OP's a model of the business that allows the executive to talk with the people who are responsible for execution at the same level of granularity. It's a real level of granularity that exists within the business, but it's not at the detailed level, because that, the executive's eyes would glaze over, and it's not so abstracted that the people who have to execute can't be held accountable for the plan. And to do that, you've got to model it the way your business is set up, and your business functions as a set of demand streams, and a set of families that you feed with those demand
Yeah.
streams. And so to me, I've often said to you, and since we started working together, like, I don't really get how you do it any other way, to be honest. Like, I think it's sort of like one of the laws of physics. Like, if you're going to model a business, it's got demand streams and families based on these constraints, and those demand streams are complex in relationship to those families. It's not a one to one. It's not even a many to one in most cases. It's a many to many, and that complexity is just the way your business is set up in the marketplace. It's your go to market strategy combined with your footprint for how you're going to make stuff. And if we don't get that into the S&OP plan, then I don't know what we're doing, because now you're
Yeah.
just making decisions based on somebody else's business that doesn't really exist. So I think
Yeah.
that's pretty powerful. So
Well, just to pick up on that for
sure,
a second, because I think the other part, like as you said, it gives that intersection for the senior executive, the leader of the business, to really kind of dig into a level without having to. I mean, I think for the people that are watching this, if your experience in SNOP is that it's like chart after chart after chart, and we just
yeah,
go through and we kind of talk about what's happening in the business.
report out.
Um, you know, what I can tell you with this 5 section sheet, and you've seen this, Marshall,
Sure.
is the first time that we build this, I can actually sit down with an executive, especially after you've had month one and month two, because that's the other beauty in here, is that
The
we
change.
actually we show the change, right? And so month one and month two, and the actuals against the plan.
Yeah.
I can actually sit down with an executive and in 10 minutes just take them through this and say, these are my questions, right? Which really should be your questions about what's happening in the business. And if just pop up this sheet again that we're looking at, because for this family, they're doing a nice job of managing their backlog, and they've done a really nice job as orders coming in, that they've really spread them out within their capabilities. So these are orders by promise date that are making up the shipping plan for the first part of the shipping for of the demand the shipping plan for this month. And so they've got it month by month. They've done a nice job of balancing that out, right? So they're, and I would say they've got a good process around the way they promise orders and manage the backlog. The challenge for this business is they certainly don't want to be in a situation where, as you see here, this was done at the beginning of, and we're a month behind here, but this was done at the beginning of February. We certainly don't want to be in a position where we have 4 months of backlog, almost 5 complete months of backlog,
Right.
right?
And we're seeing
And
more and more of that with
yeah,
the supply
yeah.
being constrained.
The good news in this case is the backlog is managed. And by the way, we pull this right out of the system. So one of the things you can tell right away is the organization managing the backlog? If
So
these
yeah, just to be clear, this is an early implementation of the 5-section sheet at a new client, not somebody who's been doing it for years. That's kind of what you mean by they're doing a good job managing backlog, and we've pulled it out of their system.
Yeah, yeah, and well, in fact, whether they were early or not, they in this case for this family, they
Mhm.
are doing a good job of managing that backlog.
Right.
But now the question is, if I want to reduce this backlog, what do I need to do? Well, that is the question, right?
That is
So
the question.
how are we going to do that, right? Well, there's a couple things that you can do, right?
Right.
One is you can figure out how do we increase production, right? So as we're filling up these buckets, because the next bucket that's going to get filled is this, July bucket that's out here. We've got to figure out how do we have more capability so we can put more orders into the July bucket. Well, it's a lot better doing that today in the February timeframe than it is waiting till July and figuring out, man, oh man, I wish we would have had more capability. But that's one thing you can do. But the other part of this is, and this is why you do have to look at it by demand streams to a certain degree, is you want to look at those demand streams and say, well, I can't reduce the backlog for everything at once. Which are the customers or the demand streams that I might want to do this for
Mhm.
first? And so we always advocate when you start out, you don't want to go all the way down to all your customers, but you pick the big ones, right? You
Yeah.
pick the big ones that matter. So we'll do a Pareto at the beginning of a project and say, my rule of thumb is you shouldn't have any more than 8 demand streams, just because if you have 10 demand streams and they were all equal, they'd all be 10% of your business, right? If you had 20 demand streams, they'd be 5% of your business. The reality is, most places you go, it's the old 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the customers are 80% of the business, and there's a significant ones that play that. Well, if I'm thinking about reducing the lead time, I want to think strategically, right? I want to think strategically how I want to do that. That links back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this, right? Which is what is the linking of strategy to the execution side of things, right? And so part of that strategy, when I think about this, is what's our go to market with what some of our major customers. So I wanted to bring it back to that, because when I say by constraint, I'm not saying that you ignore the market side of the business, but you make it so that it's let's manage the big parts of our external marketing side of things, right? So those big parts of the demand stream, and then there's going to be a bunch that you statistically forecast, and there's decisions. I mean, everybody today is making allocation or lead time decisions with their
Yeah,
customer, right?
absolutely. Yep.
And
That's
yeah, so you
ninety
want to
plus
be able
percent of
to,
our clients.
right, and so you want to be able to see that, and you want to be able to link that, link that together, and that's why there's this idea that yes, the basis has got to be the constraint because that's what I've got to build. And then I've got to be able to look at segmenting by demand. And there's different ways that we look at that's probably a whole nother
Oh yeah.
topic.
We'll
Just
definitely do it someday, I promise, but
yeah, no, that
maybe
would
not
be a
next
good one
week,
at
but
some point in time to
yeah.
talk about. But yeah, so yeah,
Well, so I'm looking at the time. I think we want to kind of put a comma on this one, and maybe we'll do a part two of this, depending on how much feedback we get with questions. But I do think that Doug, you've done a really nice job of helping us understand the reason that we're so adamant about basing families on constraints, and how powerful it's been during a season of supply chain disruption when those very constraints are moving around on us. And so this has been helpful in the extreme for people to be able to pinpoint what's gonna happen to their shipments, their customer shipments once they understand what's happening to the constraints. I do think it would be helpful at some point to do some demand side stuff. I mean, and you kind of got into it a little bit today, and maybe even just to tease another topic, the difference between demand planning and SNOP. We almost everybody we talk to thinks that their SNOP is their demand planning. I actually have met companies recently that don't really even have SNOP at all. They don't even have any supply plan execution from the demand plan, but they think they have SNOP. So back to the fundamentals, sometimes you've got to have several components in place, but it's a lot easier if we do it the constraint based family way.
if
So
if I had to tease that out as
sure,
part of a future conversation, right? It's this idea that you need to do demand planning, right? Like you need to do demand planning in some way, right? But what you need to have is a way to validate the demand plan, right, to a level that actually matters. And this is an important part of that discussion because people will say, how accurate does my forecast have to be? Well, the answer to that as a good consultant is it depends, right?
right.
But it needs to be accurate enough that the buffers I have in place between my production capability and the variation in my demand are sufficient enough to manage that gap and deliver the service levels that I want to get. So I mean, and we want to be able to see those. We want to be able to see that, right, and be able to evaluate that. And it's actually a little, in some ways, is a little easier than people think it is to at least do the evaluation of that. But
Sure.
there's some work to do on how you segment the demand. And so I don't want the takeaway, once again, from this to be when we talk about it at the constraint level that, oh, Doug just doesn't care about demand. I
Right.
absolutely care about demand, and I absolutely care about how you look at that demand. But I
It's
think
just got to flow into a view that's
it's
constraint
got to,
based.
absolutely, it's got to flow
Yeah.
into a view where the misses and the changes are ones that you're actually able to measure, right, and you're able to react to. So, all right.
Well,
Anyway,
nice job. Good talking to you again. We'll
yes.
pick it back up on the next S&OP Thursday, which is 2 weeks from today, the second week in April. I don't have the date memorized, but 3 p.m. Eastern, second week in April. We'll see you all then. Thanks for watching the Beza Performance live stream.
All right.